There's a moment after intimacy that no one warns you about. It doesn't come with fireworks or final kisses. It doesn't even leave a trace. Just silence. Sudden. Strange. Inevitable. He pulls away. You try not to panic. You try to rationalize. Maybe he's busy. Maybe he's overwhelmed. Maybe he just needs space. But underneath your logic, something deeper aches because you felt something. And you're pretty sure he did too. And now, it's quiet. It's cold. It's distant. You stare at your phone. The messages slow down. The warmth fades. His presence lingers like a half-remembered song. And the more you replay what happened, the more the silence grows teeth. Did I say too much? Did I ask for too much? Did I feel too much? You start shrinking. Not all at once, but gently like light fading before a storm. You find yourself replaying the moment when everything still felt real, searching for the exact second it all began to unravel. He touched you like he meant it. He held you like he knew your pain. He looked at you like he saw you, and still, he left. Not in a loud, cruel way, but in the way that stings more by disappearing behind a polite excuse, by drifting like mist, by making you question whether what happened ever meant what you thought it did. You're not crazy for feeling confused. You're not broken for craving closeness. You're not weak for wanting answers, because what no one tells you is that sometimes after intimacy, the person who pulled you close isn't pulling away from you, but from what you awakened in them. And sometimes, closeness doesn't feel safe to someone who's never known how to stay. So tonight, we talk about the silence. Not the kind you sit through while waiting for a reply, but the kind that wraps itself around your chest like a question with no answer. Why did he pull away after finally letting you in? If you've ever asked that question in the middle of a sleepless night, this is for you. Not to give you false hope, not to give you closure either, but to give you something more sacred. Clarity. Stay with me. Let's go where the silence begins. And if this feels like your story, if you've ever been left wondering in the wake of something that felt real, take a breath, subscribe, and let yourself feel seen. You're not alone. He didn't leave because of the way you kissed. He didn't leave because your body was too much or not enough. He didn't leave because you loved wrong. He left because for a brief moment, he felt completely seen and he wasn't ready for that kind of exposure. You didn't do anything wrong. In fact, what you did was awaken something he spent years trying to bury. That moment when your breath softened against his chest, when you looked at him like you didn't want anything but to understand, was the moment he remembered something he wasn't prepared to feel. How vulnerable it is to be wanted without having to perform. You didn't chassa him. You didn't try to impress him. You were just there. Real, present, warm. And that, to someone who only knows love through survival, feels terrifying. Because for people who carry old wounds, love doesn't feel safe, it feels dangerous. It feels like exposure. It feels like the ground might give out if they step too close. So when you offered intimacy, emotional, spiritual, physical, it cracked something open inside of him. And instead of stepping through it, he shut the door. That's what pulling away looks like sometimes. Not indifference, not manipulation, but a deep, trembling fear that closeness is a setup for loss. Maybe he grew up in a space where affection came with conditions. Maybe love was loud, chaotic, unstable. Maybe the people who were supposed to stay didn't. So now, when something real approaches, it doesn't feel like a gift. It feels like a risk. And you, unknowingly, became that risk. You reminded him of what it feels like to be truly met. And that remembrance, that soft, almost holy ache, it scared him more than rejection ever could. Because intimacy, real intimacy, isn't just about bodies touching. It's about being fully witnessed while still being fully accepted. And for some, that kind of light is unbearable. So he does what he's always done. He retreats. He pretends he's fine. He answers with short texts. He busies himself with work. He says, "I'm just going through something." But behind those words is the truth he may never say. You made me feel something real, and I don't know how to hold it. This doesn't excuse the silence. It doesn't erase the confusion. It doesn't mean you deserve breadcrumbs just because someone is scared. But maybe it can help you understand that you're not being punished for loving too deeply. You're being distanced from someone who hasn't yet made peace with their own heart. And the tragedy is, sometimes, the more emotionally safe you are, the more you trigger someone who's only known chaos. You become the mirror they weren't ready to look into. And what they see staring back at them isn't your softness, it's their unhealed self. So when he pulls away after something that felt so close, so sacred, he's not pulling away from your body, he's not pulling away from your energy, he's pulling away from the feeling that you created, the one that says, this could be safe, this could be real, this could change me. And sometimes when someone has worn armor for too long, even love feels like a threat. It's not that he didn't feel it, it's that he felt too much. And without the tools to face it, the only move he knows is retreat. The silence after intimacy has a way of speaking louder than words ever could. You start rereading old messages, replaying memories, looking for signs. Not signs that he cared, you already know he did, but signs of when it started to shift, when the warmth began to cool, when his eyes stopped lingering, when he started feeling far, even when he was still near. You don't tell anyone what's happening at first, because how do you explain that someone pulled away right after pulling you in? So you hold it. You carry it in your chest like a secret bruise. You tell yourself, maybe I made him feel suffocated. Maybe I said too much. Maybe I gave too much. But none of that is true. What you gave was presence. What you offered was openness. And what he couldn't hold was exactly that. Because here's what no one tells you. Sometimes the thing that scares someone most is being loved without having to earn it. You didn't demand. You didn't pressure. You didn't make him prove anything. And that, to someone who has only known love through conditions, feels foreign, almost threatening. Because when you're used to performing for affection, real love feels like a trap. So what does he do? He distances. He rationalizes. He tells himself he's not ready. He tells himself you're too much, or not enough, or just not quite right. Not because it's true, but because if he admits you were exactly what he longed for, he'd have to confront why he ran from it. And that kind of honesty, it rips open everything he's spent years building to protect himself. But the cruel part is this. You're the one left wondering. You're the one pacing your own mind. You're the one holding the weight of his retreat as if it says something about you. It doesn't. You were real. You were present. You were soft in a world that punishes softness. And you offered connection in a moment when it mattered most. That is not a flaw. That is not a mistake. That is courage. But pain has a way of rewriting our memories. You start asking, was I too vulnerable? Did I misread everything? Why do I always care more? Why does it always end the moment it feels real? These aren't just your questions. These are the echoes of old wounds. Maybe this silence reminds you of another silence. Maybe his distance feels familiar in a way you wish it didn't. And that's where it gets complicated. Because it's not just him you're trying to reach. It's the part of you that's still waiting for someone to stay. Still hoping someone will say, I see you. I'm not going anywhere. But every time someone leaves without explanation, it feels like that part of you breaks a little more. And yet, you're still here, still showing up, still choosing to believe in something real, even when the world keeps telling you it's safer not to. That's not weakness, that's power. Because what no one sees is how brave it is to stay open in the face of retreat, how bold it is to love when you've been left before, and how healing it is to look at the silence, and instead of blaming yourself, whisper back, I know what I gave, and it was real. Because here's the truth most people never hear. Just because someone can't hold your heart doesn't mean your heart is too heavy. Sometimes it just means they were never taught how to carry something that precious. And maybe it's not your job to make them ready. Maybe your only job is to stay whole. There's a quiet kind of grief that comes from being the one who stayed open. It doesn't look dramatic. It doesn't scream. It just lingers. In the space where a reply never came. In the mornings you wake up and check your phone out of habit. In the silence between your breaths where you used to feel connection, you mourn things that never had names. Moments that never became promises. Connections that felt real but ended like dreams, sudden, disorienting, unspoken. And the hardest part? You keep wondering if you imagined all of it. Because how could someone hold you so closely, only to vanish? How could someone look into you like they saw home, and then lock the door behind them? That's the thing about emotional intimacy. It doesn't ask for time. It asks for presence. And even if you only shared a single night, a few sacred conversations, or a moment where everything in you said, this matters, you're allowed to grieve it because it did matter, not because it lasted, but because it opened something in you. And that's the part they don't tell you. Sometimes the deepest love doesn't end with closure, it ends with silence. And silence is where your mind starts lying to you. You were too deep. You should have been cooler. Maybe he left because you expected too much. But let's be clear, you didn't scare him with your feelings. You didn't lose him because you were open. You didn't push him away by being real. What happened is that he reached his limit, not because you asked for more than he could give, but because you reflected more than he could face. And that's not something you could control. Your softness, it's not the enemy. Your warmth, not a weapon. Your desire to be understood, not a flaw. They may have pulled away, but not because of something broken in you. They pulled away because they were not yet ready to be that seen, that felt, that held. You showed them something they didn't know how to hold. And maybe something they never even believed they deserved. And sometimes, when people don't feel worthy of love, they leave before it can reach them. Not because it's not real, but because it's too real. And reality, when you've lived behind walls, feels unbearable. So they sabotage. They pull back. They give less. They test to see if you'll chase, because that's the dance they've always known. But you didn't play the game. You didn't beg. You didn't plead. You didn't shrink into something smaller just to keep them close. And in that silence, something powerful happened. You realized you're not here to convince anyone to stay. You're not here to be chosen by someone who doesn't even know how to choose themselves. You're here to stand fully in your truth, even when it means standing alone. And that's not bitterness. That's not ego. That's self-respect, because what they pulled away from was the very thing they'll keep searching for in others, but never truly find again, because no one loves quite like you do. No one listens quite like you do. No one sees them quite the way you did. And one day, when the noise quiets and the distractions fade, they'll remember not just the moments, but the feeling of being understood without being asked to perform. They'll remember your calm, your silence that wasn't empty but full of safety, your presence that didn't demand but invited. And maybe they'll wonder why they ran. But by then, you won't be waiting for an answer, because you'll finally understand. They didn't leave because of who you are. They left because of who they weren't ready to become. It wasn't your job to heal what he refused to face. It wasn't your role to hold together something he kept pulling away from. You weren't supposed to twist yourself into a softer version, a quieter version, a version he might finally choose. That's the heartbreak no one talks about. Not just the loss of him, but the version of you that believed maybe, if you just gave more, he would stay. But love that requires self-abandonment isn't love. It's survival. And you weren't made to survive someone else's emotional confusion. You were made to live fully, openly, boldly, even if that means being too much for someone who hasn't yet learned how to receive. The truth is, you didn't ask for too much. You just asked someone who had nothing to give to meet you where you were ready. You asked for presence from someone still hiding in their absence. You asked for truth from someone who's been running from their own. And when the answer came back in silence, in distance, in that slow ghosting ache you feel in your bones, it didn't mean your questions were wrong. It meant he wasn't ready to answer them. Because when a man hasn't learned how to sit with his emotions, he'll disappear into logic. When he hasn't learned how to face his fears, he'll distract himself with busyness. And when he hasn't learned how to love himself, he will run from anyone who dares to love him fully. That's what you walked into. And it's not your fault. You didn't trigger him by being open. You revealed him. You exposed a wound he spent his whole life ignoring. And you did it not with pressure, not with demands, but with honesty, with eye contact, with gentleness, with the kind of presence that only feels safe to those who have first made peace with their own heart. And maybe he'll come back one day, not for closure, but because he finally realizes what you gave wasn't ordinary. But by then, something inside of you will have shifted. You'll no longer be the one waiting for clarity from someone who refused to give it. You'll no longer chase meaning in a silence that never belonged to you. You'll know, in your soul, that you weren't rejected. You were misunderstood by someone who didn't yet understand himself. And instead of carrying that as shame, you'll carry it as a reminder of what it means to be real in a world that keeps asking you to be less. Of how powerful your love is when it's given without agenda. Of how healing your presence is even for those who never learned how to stay. You gave him something rare. You offered connection without control. You invited without demanding. You loved without asking him to change. And in return, he left. Not because you were wrong, but because you were right. before he was ready to be. So now, you're standing in the after. The questions still echo, the memories still whisper, the ache still hums in the quiet hours. But something else has taken root. A knowing, a deep, sacred knowing, that the love you gave was never wasted. You kept thinking the story ended when he pulled away, as if his distance meant something about your worth, as if his silence was a verdict, as if you were left behind because you loved wrong. But maybe the pulling away wasn't the end. Maybe it was the beginning, not of another heartbreak, but of something softer, wiser, yours. Because at some point, the questions start to fade. You stop trying to decode his patterns. You stop waiting for closure in the form of a late-night apology. You stop hoping that his return will somehow stitch together the parts of you he left unraveling. And instead, you turn inward. You walk back into yourself. At first, it's quiet, unfamiliar. You were so used to reaching for someone else, trying to understand them, fix them, love them deeper than they loved themselves. But now, the reach turns inward. You sit with your own ache. You touch the parts of you that begged for someone to stay. And you don't silence them. You don't shame them. You listen. Because beneath all that grief, there's something sacred waiting. Not answers, but truth. The kind that can't be taken away when someone leaves. The kind that doesn't vanish when the text doesn't come. The kind that lives in your spine, in your breath, in the quiet strength of choosing yourself over and over again. And when you finally stop romanticizing the silence, when you stop making it mean rejection, you begin to see it for what it was. Protection. Not because he was harmful, but because you were ready to grow in ways he wasn't ready to witness. Because if he stayed, you might have shrunk. You might have kept overgiving. You might have dimmed your light to match the flicker he could handle. But something deeper pulled him away. And something deeper kept you still. And in that stillness, you begin to rise. Not in rage, not in bitterness, not in trying to glow up so he sees what he lost, but in a way that's quieter, truer. You rise by remembering who you are without being reflected in his eyes. You rise by loving the part of you that wanted to be chosen, and choosing her first. You rise by realizing you never needed to be less to be loved. You just needed someone who could meet you where you already were, not someone you had to wait for. And when the day comes that he scrolls through your name, hears your laugh in someone else's voice, smells something that reminds him of the night you leaned into his chest and whispered without fear, he'll remember. Haven't say it. He may never reach out, but somewhere deep in his chest, he'll feel the space where your presence once lived. And you won't need him to fill it, because you've already returned to yourself. You've stopped asking why he pulled away, and started asking why you kept chasing people who don't stay. You've stopped rehearsing conversations in your head, and started writing new ones with yourself, with people who show up, with love that stays soft even when it's tested. This is the part where you stop bleeding for those who never offered a bandage. This is the part where your healing is no longer a performance, it's your peace. You stopped trying to understand him the day you started understanding yourself. And that's when everything changed. Because for so long, your love had been a mirror, reflecting what others couldn't face, showing them the tenderness they abandoned in themselves, hoping they'd see their own worth because you saw it first. But now, you hold the mirror inward, not to critique, not to find flaws, but to remember who you are, what you give, and how rare your love truly island. Because what no one tells you is that when someone pulls away after intimacy, it doesn't always mean the love was fake. Sometimes it means it was too real for someone still pretending. And now, you don't take their retreat personally. You don't shrink to avoid loss. You don't perform to keep someone interested. You've learned how to stay even when someone else leaves. You've learned how to soothe your ache without turning it into proof that you're unlovable. You've learned that closure isn't always a conversation. Sometimes it's a quiet knowing. I gave real love, and that's enough. You're no longer chasing people who confuse closeness with danger. You're no longer offering your softness as currency to be chosen. You're no longer begging for clarity in the places where silence has already answered everything. And slowly, something begins to settle in your chest. A calm, a certainty, a sense that love isn't something you need to earn, it's something you are. He may never come back. He may never admit what you stirred in him, but he will remember, not just you, but how he felt in your presence, the safety, the breath, the way time slowed. And one day, he'll realize you didn't just touch his body, you touched his truth. And that doesn't fade. But your life won't be built around his remembering. It will be built around your becoming, and you'll meet someone one day, maybe not soon, who doesn't flinch when things get real, who doesn't disappear after the closeness, who doesn't get quieter the moment you get softer, because they've done the work, they've met their own shadow, they've walked through their fears and found a place within themselves stable enough to stay. And when they look at you, they won't be surprised by your love. They'll be ready for it, because they'll have the language to hold it, the presence to match it, the maturity to honor it. But until then, you'll walk with yourself, and you'll find that was the real love story all along. So if you're sitting there right now, heart heavy, eyes tired, still checking your phone even when you know the silence will stay, come closer, not to chase him, not to fix anything, but to be with the part of you that was never the problem. You didn't break anything, you didn't ruin the moment, you didn't imagine the connection. He felt it too, and even if he couldn't name it, even if he disappeared into the comfort of his distance, even if he left you alone with all the noise, that doesn't mean your love was a mistake. Sometimes, love only lasts long enough to show us where we still abandon ourselves. And sometimes, losing someone is the only way we find our way back. So tonight, maybe you don't need answers. Maybe you don't need closure. Maybe all you need is to whisper, "I was there, I was real, I'm still here." And that's enough. If this reached you in a quiet place, if you felt seen, held, or understood, know that you're not alone. There are others walking this same silence, and together, we're learning not to run from it, but to sit inside it until it becomes peace. So if this voice felt like a hand on your shoulder, if you want more moments like this, more reminders that your softness is strength, stay close, subscribe, share this with someone who might need to hear it too. And until next time, keep choosing the love that doesn't pull away when things get real, because that's the love that begins with you.